Hello friends, welcome to this session in our course on the Introduction to the Qur'an. The topic of this session in particular is the Qur'an and theology, and this is a special session because we have a distinguished guest who will be speaking to us about this topic, Dr. Ebrahim Moosa. Dr. Moosa is Professor of Islamic Studies in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the Department of History at the University of Notre Dame. He'll soon be a senior member in the Keough School of Global Affairs at Notre Dame and has a distinguished record of publishing. And I thought I'd mention just a couple of his books here. He's published in 2005 a work that won the American Academy of Religion Prize entitled Ghazali, the great Muslim scholar, theologian, philosopher Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination. And he's published a number of books since then, some of them edited, including The African Renaissance and The Afro-Arab Spring, Islam in the Modern World, and Muslim Family Law in Sub-Saharan Africa, Colonial Legacies and Post-Colonial Challenges. Most recently, and I'm delighted to announce, Professor Moosa has published a book entitled What is a Madrasa? And so I'd like to welcome him first. Welcome, Dr. Moosa.
Professor Reynolds, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you and your students.
I'm delighted you're here. And in fact, I thought the first question we might ask you a bit about this book. Could you explain what's behind the book? What is a madrasa?
So what is a madrasa is partly autobiographical and partly telling the story of those institutions in South Asia known as the madrasas, seminaries, Islamic seminaries, that after 9/11 has come under a great deal of attack because of some madrasas' connections to the Taliban. Right. But I'm trying to tell a bigger story about the history of those institutions, the work they do in today's Muslim societies, and the way Muslims get orthodox education and orthodox learning from those institutions. So I'm hoping that your viewers will get time to read this book and understand a very complex dynamic about education, change and transformation in Islamic thought.
Terrific. Well, the madrasa, of course, is a central locus for Muslim theological reflection, and that's what we'll be speaking about today, and in particular, the Qur'an and theology. And maybe it's worth stating what this session is not. There's a long tradition of reflection by Muslim theologians using reason and the sources of revelation in Islam, the Qur'an and the Sunnah, or the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad, to think about abstract theological notions. But what I'd like to speak about with you is more what the Qur'an itself says on theological topics, or maybe better put, what does the Qur'an say about God? And what are the sort of questions that have arisen for Muslim scholars reflecting on what the Qur'an says about God? I thought we'd start with two well-known Muslim scholars who have reflected on this topic. The first is the great Pakistani, later University of Chicago professor by the name of Fazlur Rahman, who wrote a book entitled Major Themes of the Qur'an, extremely influential work, which you wrote, in fact, the preface to it in the most recent edition. And I thought I'd ask a particular question about something you say there in that preface, which is something about another Indian, sort of very influential in what became Pakistan, of course, but Indian scholar, South Asian scholar named Muhammad Iqbal. Maybe you need to say a few words about him, but I'll give you the quotation, then I'll let you take it away. So you write how Iqbal lamented the fact of how past Muslim scholars have interpreted the Qur'an according to Greek categories. And Iqbal says, or you say, sort of paraphrasing him, they missed the sensate and embodied spirit of the Qur'an that was essentially anti-classical, opposed to the classical heritage of the Greco-Roman world. In other words, it resisted abstract notions of the divinity. So I thought I'd ask about that. What does this mean? What does it mean to resist abstract notions of the divinity in our thought about the God of the Qur'an?
You know, Iqbal was the great poet-philosopher of the subcontinent, and he studied both in Germany and prior to that in England, where he has subsequently developed a major reputation as a major poet-philosopher. So a lot of Iqbal's ideas come through poetry. Right. And the link between Iqbal and Fazlur Rahman is quite interesting, because I think in some ways Fazlur Rahman and his ideas draws on some of Iqbal's inspiration. So I think that, you know, both Iqbal being a philosopher and Fazlur Rahman, who studied Ibn Sina many years when he started off his career, later in life, Fazlur Rahman begins to say that he became disenchanted with the God of philosophers, and he wanted to find the God of the Quran. And then, as you see, Fazlur Rahman's own career, as it develops over time, increasingly centers on the Quran. And that's what I wrote in the preface to the latest edition of the book, is that Fazlur Rahman's own intellectual career goes through multiple changes from philosophy, Ibn Sina, then he becomes what people call a Muslim modernist. But finally he thinks that the Quran has the answers to a lot of the questions for modern Islamic thought. And then someplace in one of his essays that he wrote about his career, he says that I became tired of the God of philosophers that is so abstract.
Right.
And he said, I want to discover the God that listens to your prayers and pulsates with your heart, and a God that responds to your emotions. And I thought, where does Fazlur Rahman get that from? And I saw it interestingly in Iqbal, and therefore I cited Iqbal, that Iqbal started becoming quite unhappy about what he saw as a not the most productive understanding of the Quran because of the classical legacy that talked about the God of the Quran in some kind of abstract theological terms.
Sorry to interrupt you, but it wouldn't be right though to state that Iqbal is suggesting that the God of the Quran is a personal God, or that wouldn't be the right word, would it? Or sort of has a personal connection with each individual believer, or would it? How would
I think he wants something more than just a God that is out there, utterly transcendent.
Right.
And so, as you well know, that the God of the Quran is somewhere between utterly transcendent and closer than your jugular vein, right? So when the Quran talks about there's nothing like unto him,
right,
laysa kamithlihi shay,
right,
and on another place it says that we are closer to you than your jugular vein.
right.
So it's somewhere between this dialectic, right? So I'm introducing the word dialectic again, which is very classical, right? So we cannot get away too far from the classical legacy.
Right.
But I think Iqbal was saying that often the message of the Quran got shrouded by this ancient legacy of abstract thinking, and he felt that the reader of the Quran must feel the God, must feel God in some way. Now, whether that's the language of the Quran, whether it's the emotional imagination that kicks in, I think it's something along those lines that he's talking about, that it must be an imaginative, emotive response that Iqbal seems to urge one to adopt when reading the Quran, rather than thinking of God in these very abstract terms that Muslim theologians were very good at, as you well know, that they abstracted the Godhead and talked about attributes in order to help us understand the divine. But clearly Iqbal wanted something more than that.
Right.
And so he wanted you to feel God as you're reading. So I think one of the places that I think I could draw your viewers' attention to is when the Quran says that those, when they read the scriptures and they read the Quran and the revelation, that their skins begin to feel the emotive effect. In other words, they and that it says that they get almost a kind of a fever. يَقْشَعِرُّ بِهِ جُلُودُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, right? That they have this feeling because of reverence and awe of what they are reading. So it's this awe that you must be able to feel when you're engaging and communing with the divine. So I think Iqbal is talking about it's so that it's not about reading the Quran, but it's about through the Quran that you have commune with the divine.
Great. So it's perfect that you quote a verse of the Quran here, because I think what interests me especially is sort of discerning what is particular of the vision, the Quran's vision of God. Because, I mean, when it comes to monotheism and monotheistic religions, we can always think of God, as you alluded to, in abstract terms. We can think of, well, one God, vaguely creator, vaguely seeing, knowing, omnipotent, these sort of things. But of course, any monotheistic tradition that has a scripture, that has a revelation, in that revelation says something about God, is introducing something new, some new data about God. And I thought we'd turn to that in the text of this work we've alluded to, the major themes of the Quran by Fazlur Rahman. And I'd like to read a quotation from that and get your reaction to it. Rahman, at some point, he speaks about sort of the way the Quran speaks of opponents to its vision of things as they are, its vision of God. He alludes to the Quran's opposition to Christian doctrine in certain ways. And then he says this, but the most vicious, that is, the most vicious opponents for the Quran are those who formally or substantively deny God's existence, materialistic atheists, and those who assign partners to God. I think this is a challenging question, so forgive me, but I wonder if you could speak about this, about particularly the latter part. Why is the Quran so concerned with those who assign partners to God? Why is that so offensive? Or why is that almost enter into the domain of sin, to assign partners to God? Why is the God of the Quran so vigilant in opposing that sort of disposition?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and I think one has to problematize it from various angles. Islam coming after Christianity, I think it has that background, as you alluded to, about the way in which the triune God is presented. And I think I would say that Islam is both understanding of the God of Christianity, but has some reservations about the articulation of that. Right. When the Quran refers to polytheists, it does not particularly refer to Christians, but it does say the polytheists, the first audience of polytheists are the Meccans, right, who believe in multiple deities. But then it says that when Jesus is asked, there's a story in the Quran when Jesus will be asked, did you ever tell people to worship you and your mother? And according to the Quran, Jesus will say, no, I never did that. Right. So I think it's a question about the understanding of the triune God on one hand, and I think early Muslim theologians like Ghazali and others say one can easily think about that in terms of attributes. If you think of the triune God as three dimensions of a single Godhead, Ghazali says, that could be something similar to that. Right. I think the problem that the Quran has is about worshipping a dimension of that Godhead as the ultimate. And that's, I think, the kind of objection the Quran has, that it wants the ultimate only to be God. So even a Muslim cannot worship an attribute of God. Right. Must worship the full God. Right. Now, I think
it also uses this language of partners, right? Assigning partners. We know this category of shirk.
Shirk. Yeah. So don't assign partners. That's a constant refrain. So I think the question here is, on the one hand, it has this concern that you mustn't assign partners to God. I think because it wants the moral response. I think the larger thrust of the Quran is how to connect the individual and the divine in order to create a moral responsibility within a human being. So it's about this moral drive, and this moral drive whose ultimate resource and resting place must be to satisfy God, to do things for God and for God only. You cannot do it for any other reason, not for your ego, not for your self-promotion, only to earn God's satisfaction, God's grace, God's generosity out of that. Okay, so that's this God link. And I think the Quran thinks any other kind of dimension will be interfering in that relationship, in that link. Right. So it's about trying to lessen down the side noise.
And it takes it serious. I mean, we have this verse in Surah An-Nisa, for example, the 4th chapter or surah of the Quran, which says, basically, it's the unforgivable sin. Right. God will not forgive that partners are ascribed to Him, but other than that, He'll forgive what He wills, or something like that.
Yeah, and you see, I have doubts whether Christians fall under that category. Right. I think it's about this all-out, very unrestricted form of polytheism the Quran is talking about there, and that polytheism will not be forgiven. Now, I think Muslim doctrine possibly, and the Quran talks about Christians as people who worship God and who revere God, and they will earn paradise, and those who believe good things, do good things and believe in the last day, whether they're Jews, Christians or Sabians, they will all enter into paradise, and God will forgive them. I think it's more of a kind of a cautionary conversation with certain kinds of Christian theology, I think. So I would be reluctant to say that Christians are included in that, but there are some Muslims who would take a hard line and say that some interpretation of Christianity, when you take the worship of the other dimensions of the triune God, for them that would be problematic theologically.
Interesting. So I'm fascinated by the way you explained the insistence on monotheism in the Qur'an, or at least in the exclusive sort of sovereignty and worship of the God of the Qur'an only.
Right.
We see, it's interesting to notice in many translations of the Qur'an now, probably most of them, at least recent translations, the Arabic word for God, Allah, is retained in English. Not all of them, many of them. Very often, in fact, the translation that we're using in this course, which is by a Lebanese scholar named Talal Itani, he's published his translation in 2 versions. And there's only one difference between the 2 versions, which is the translation of God, or of Allah, I should say. There's the God version and the Allah version of the Itani translation.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that, I mean, it's both the problematic and possibly some people want to identify and say and signal something with this use. So I think in the first on the one hand, if we thinking about the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to be the same God, then the word God works for everybody.
Right.
Christians would use the word Allah when they referring to God. In Arabic, or if they speak Urdu, or ilah, which is also the word the Quran uses for the divine. So I think that this is a narrowing of the conversation by insisting on Allah. It's kind of it heads towards a certain kind of exclusivism. I can understand people's concern that when people think that the word God is often associated with European languages, and that European languages have a strong Christian cultural formation, but I don't think anybody will misunderstand that to be only mean the triune God. So I think that some Muslims are trying to push against the triune God, but I think most people, when they say God, they mean the ultimate creator of the universe in European languages, and I think that's what Muslims will also understand. So I think it's somewhat unnecessary, and it forespells something that some people are trying to communicate. For me, it's a something that is reeks of narrowing and a certain kind of exclusivism, and it does not enhance inter-civilizational, inter-religious communication.
Right. Very interesting. So I want to go back to a point you raised earlier, which is how we can understand the Quranic insistence on monotheism in light of the moral demands that the Quran makes on humans.
Right.
That there's a certain responsibility humans have towards the one God, their creator, only towards this God. I'd like to speak a little bit about that, because the Quran elsewhere, it seems to emphasize, let's say, even the fear of God in a positive sense. And I'd like to speak a little bit about that. Again, let me turn to Fazlur Rahman, who's sort of the third person in the room here, our conversation partner in absence, I should say. Rahman writes, God's friendship, that's probably important, that use of the word, may not be presumed at any point, either by any individual or by either an individual or any community, even though the Quran speaks of God's promises to individuals and communities. Instead, now he introduces an Arabic word, one must exercise taqwa, meaning that if one has the proper perception, then one must be constantly, and I think this is his translation of taqwa, on one's guard. So could you comment on this? What does it mean to feel a sense of taqwa towards God? Or why should someone feel the necessity of being on one's guard from God?
I think it again speaks against a certain kind of backdrop of Near Eastern religions that preceded Islam. And I think Fazl Rahman is insisting on this idea of taqwa, that to be on one's guard or to be morally alert, which also means to be in awe of God, against the backdrop that you cannot take God for granted. That just because you belong to a certain community doesn't mean that you got God in your pocket. Therefore, you cannot take God for granted, and it's a fight that Islam has about anybody claiming, because we were chosen by God, therefore we can do whatever we want.
Right.
And I think that is the message that is being transmitted here, and that is that you must be on your guard. It's through your actions and your practices that you will earn God's favor, not because you were chosen by God and give through this prophet or another prophet,
right,
or a particular tradition or a church or a religious tradition that you might have. Right. And I think this is a message for contemporary Muslims too. Just because they were born into this tradition, that they have certain promises through this tradition, does not mean that the tradition itself and the community is going to give you salvation, but you as an individual must be on your guard. You need to comply with the requirements of God's demands.
So there's this individual focus and the Quranic's moral worldview.
Exactly. The thing that you're going to get communal salvation because you belong to this community, while the Quran encourages you to stay with the group. But the group itself is not the promise of salvation. Right. It's every individual shall be measured by their deeds. Right. Whoever does good, the amount of a mustard seed's weight, will see it then on a day of judgment, the Quran says, and whoever does evil or wrong, that of a mustard seed's weight, which is very light and a small amount, almost atomic weight, will see it then. Yes. So it's about the individual. That is what is being combated here, is this presumption that you have a free pass to heaven.
Interesting. The mustard seed is used quite differently in the gospel as a metaphor for the kingdom of God. Wow. Because it becomes this tree in which the birds shade, it becomes this large tree. But wow. Here in the Quran we see it used in this sort of this moral application. Yeah. So the Quran elsewhere, I think, speaking about this same topic, maybe connected to taqwa, but you can correct me on this, because one sort of naughty issue in the Quran about which Muslim believers have debated is the language the Quran sometimes uses in regard to God, in which it says that not only must one sort of be on one's guard rather in regard to God, but also that God actually has a sort of active, almost opposition to unbelievers. When it uses language, for example, Quran chapter 2, verse 6, as for those who disbelieve, it is the same for them, whether you have warned them or have not warned them, they do not believe. In verse 7, God has set a seal on their hearts and on their hearing, and over their vision is a veil. So it's that language that interests me here in this question. God has set a seal on their hearts. Chapter 9 or Surah 9 verse 67 speaks about the unbelievers forget God, so God forgets them. What's the best way to understand statements like that, which actually suggest that God almost actively prohibits almost unbelievers from coming to belief? Or is this sort of hyperbolic or exaggerated language which the Quran uses for the sake of its exhortation?
Mm-hmm. I think it's the latter that you just said. It's this hyperbolic language that occurs at the end of larger conversations. So prior to this, there are discussions and there are passages that talk about the prophets inviting people to accept God, whether it's Noah or Jesus or Moses, and they go over continuously inviting people to worship God, to follow God's path, and then they reject God, right? They reject the prophets and they reject the messages. It's after all that effort had been made to invite them, and because their hearts are sealed, then God says, okay, this is like giving comfort to the believers of the time that those people who are now the enemies of God, God has sealed their hearts, right? And whether you invite them or don't invite them, they will never come back to you. So these are those people who are resilient in their opposition to God. Is in that's how this language emerges. But it doesn't really mean that if those people make an effort, right? And that's what the tradition also talks about, that if you take a step towards God, God hastens towards you. So this is at the conclusion of people who have resolved that they will not be part of the God team.
Maybe that language of forgetting God, they've forgotten God in the sense of almost in a permanent way. They've shut their minds from the awareness of God.
Yeah, and that's I really like that passage. وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُم. That don't be like those who forget God. Then they have forgotten themselves. Right. So this self-forgetting is not taking an active role in denying who you are and what your origin is, right? That it's God who created you, it's from God that we come, and that human beings, through their arrogance, through their faux learning, believe that they are who they are, that they are entirely materialistic, that there's no transcendent. And denying the transcendent and denying knowledge of the transcendent is about self-forgetting. And then God forgets you, right? And in other words, you've denied God. So the language is hyperbolic, but it's about the relationality. So, I mean, in some ways, okay, if that's how you want to play, you want to forget us, okay, then we forget you too, okay? And see where you go, okay? So it's a very strong language. If you want to be in your face, God can be in your face too, right? If you want to be in the face of God, then God says, I can be in your face too. Now, of course, there are other passages that say that, you know, that our mercy overwhelms all things, and those kinds of passages play in this too. But these are passages that are isolated, that talk in this very strong language.
You can really sense the richness of the Quran's language on God and the relationship between God and humans, and all of the possibilities for interpreters, and you see where the richness of Islamic intellectual reflection comes from.
Yeah, it's a language. It's a great language game that is being played here.
So I wanted to ask another question about this language, because in your response I sort of also use similar sorts of vocabulary, but we were speaking about Quranic language as maybe in cases hyperbolic, or I don't know if there's a simpler word to use other than hyperbolic, expressing hyperbole or sort of over-intensification, exaggeration. Is that okay in light of traditional Islamic thought on the Quran? You know, the traditional Islamic thought, of course, is that the Quran is an inimitable text, a perfect text. It's the word of God itself. There's a whole tradition, of course, of examining the language and the Quran's use of rhetoric, and we have scholars all the way from Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian rigorist, to someone like the modernist and moderate figure Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd, who've written about this. I mean, can we use this language in light of Islamic tradition, hyperbole and those sorts of things for the Quran's language? Is that consistent enough with notions of inimitability of the Quran?
I think so. I think that the very fact that the Quran uses terms and flowery language at times of how compassionate God is, and sometimes very angry language, and to make a point, is precisely part of the inimitability, that it has this kind of rhetorical effect, right? So much of the Quran is rhetoric, and it's precisely this rhetoric in the conversations between multiple audiences that has that beauty.
It's using sort of all the possibilities of human language
to make a point. So I think this, it's not a way. Now, you know, hyperbole is not a bad thing because it's a linguistic effect. So it delivers its point. Now it depends also on the reader and how comprehensive an interpretation you want to give to all the different passages of the Quran. Then you see it as a unity. Then these ups and these downs are all part of its continuous beauty, rather than thinking that, oh, this is exaggerated hyperbole. No, the Quran cannot participate in hyperbole. It can. It's a rhetorical effect, and it tries to hit the heart, as it says, right? It tries to make an impact on the heart. So it does use emotive language, and this is emotive language in order to show and demonstrate to these audiences what it's trying to do. So think of the Quran as a constant conversation between different parties, and you need to fill in the background picture. Who is talking? What is the talk? What's the nature of the talk? What are the passages before that, or a couple of pages before that? Also, all kinds of things going on.
It's not enough to isolate one phrase or one turn of phrase.
One turn of phrase, exactly.
Without the context.
Without the context, yes.
Well, I just like to ask two more questions, and then we'll let you go. It's really wonderful to have you here and to be able to.
I'm enjoying this.
Access the riches of your own personal background and depth of knowledge on this. And I'd like to speak about maybe two particular, let's say two sets of, or two questions in which sort of tension between different theological or moral values seem to be at stake. And the first is about God's mercy and God's justice. And I thought we'd, as an introduction to this question, you might already have alluded to this verse, but let me read Quran chapter 7, or Surah 7, verse 156. Here we read, "My punishment I inflicted upon whomever I will, but my mercy encompasses all things. Rahmati wasa'at kulla shay." How can these two go together? On the one hand, God can strike, it seems, with his vengeance or his punishment whenever he wills and whomever he wills. But somehow the mercy seems to be greater than that, to encompass everything. How do you understand these two going together?
So the passage before this is about Moses, right? Talking to, appealing to God and saying, we will do as you said, we will ask for forgiveness, we'll take the people to go into repentance and so on. And this is what God replies. That, as you stated there, that my punishment I will inflict it upon whomever I will, but my mercy encompasses all things. Right. So it seems that the context was that Moses' people did something really offensive, and so now they had to repent. And God is just restating here that I'm sovereign. It's my sovereignty. Because you have disobeyed, there ought to be a certain penalty and the infliction, but I can also forgive you. I can give you mercy, and that's what is prescribed here. So you will often find that the Quran points out the exactitude that God can enforce because of a contravention of a rule or regulation or moral practice that people have done. But then he immediately threatens with his mercy. He said, my mercy can soften all this, right? So it's inviting you to fall into the weigh scale of mercy rather than that of justice, because God's justice is very difficult to deal with. Right. And it's, of course, we get overwhelmed by the divine justice because its exactitude and the punishment is something that no human being can bear.
Well, just to give one example, we have these accounts in the Quran that Western scholars have labeled the punishment stories. So these stories of sort of one people after another being destroyed by God usually because of their disbelief, rejecting the messenger whom God has sent and disbelieving in God. And one could almost say that, the story is over once God has destroyed these people. They might have had a chance to believe if only they hung around longer, if God waited longer, right? But the story is over. So, but at the same time, we then have the invocation to every surah in the Quran, but the ninth surah, Surah At-Tawbah, which begins in the name of God, the merciful, the benevolent, or merciful, the compassionate. So it seems like readers are really challenged to put these two together.
Right. And it's precisely, I think I will refer again to what I said earlier, and that is that it's about keeping human beings within a kind of a moral constraint, right? It's about this moral constraint that the justice aspect is repeated through these various stories, that people who, when the deadline came and they did not fulfill their obligations, or when they repeatedly and gave such grave offense by killing the prophets, right? Yes. And they killed the prophets, and there was so much corruption on earth, and God warned them over and over that you should, fall in line, and they don't. And when all the deadlines are contravened, that's when the punishment comes. Yes. But at the same time, as you correctly pointed out, that the mercy is always there. So if at the last, in all these stories you will find there's one person who walked away and he found God's mercy and becomes the founder of a whole new community, or the person of God that survived.
Well, we have the story of Jonah, where you actually have a whole people who come to believe at the last moment and they're saved.
And they get saved. Or, Noah and some of a few band of his followers, who believe in God, and they get saved and the rest don't. So you get these two stories all the time.
That's interesting, the Noah bit, because in the Bible it's only his family. But the Quran seems to suggest that there's a small group of followers.
And according to the biblical tradition, that the big ship that Noah had, lots of animals also get saved, right?
Right.
So exactly. Very ecological.
Well, I was going to go on to one last question, if that's okay. And it's about another, as I mentioned, sort of tension that people will sometimes find in the Quran. And maybe they find tension where it's not really there. But it's about this question of the nearness of God vis-a-vis his transcendence or sublimity. Sometimes people say, well, the God of the Quran is totally transcendent, totally other. And the way that Islamic tradition maybe has resisted any anthropomorphisms or comparisons between God and human qualities, sort of it makes this even more distinct. And then we have other sort of sample verses in the Quran which suggest that God is quite near. The most famous one you alluded to earlier says, we created the human being and we know what his soul whispers to him, and we are nearer to him than his jugular vein. And then it finishes, as the two receivers receive, seated to the right and to the left. But that phrase in the middle, nearer to him than his jugular vein, of course, has a great impact in Islamic mystical tradition, and I think is very important in the spiritual life of many Muslims. How do these go together? I mean, God of the Qur'an, sometimes the Arabic word Rabb is emphasized, whereas the believer is Abd, servant or even slave. So that seems to be sort of God is transcendent, powerful, sovereign, sublime. But God's also near. How do you see these two going together?
And I think that's the tension. I think Islam differentiates itself by saying that it's something that we cannot grasp where God is. So I think it's struggling with the tension. Is God immanent in the world? Is God in the smell of the roses, and is God in the air, in nature? And is God within us, or is God beyond us? Right? I mean, that's a struggle.
Yes,
that's a struggle.
And you have different answers to
and
those
we have
questions.
Different answers to all these questions. So Iqbal, for instance, has a great poem in which he thinks about God being in the breast and in the sounds of the nightingale, and in the orchards, and where you can smell the divine indirectly through the fragrance of flowers and so on, and not really saying God is the flower, right? But it's that
that would be too far.
That would be too far. Exactly. So it's this nearness and yet not there. So it's simulacrum. It simulates itself as if it is and it is not at the same time. And so that's, I think, the way in which the Quran struggles to present the complexity of the divine to its readers. And I think the passage you quoted, that we created human beings and we know what its nafs whispers to it. And the word nafs is interesting because the word nafs is a what we call a homograph.
This is the word that Itani translates as soul.
As soul. But the word nafs as a homograph has multiple meanings. The one meaning is the person, right? And the other meaning is that the word nafs refers to the spirit/soul within us. And there's another meaning that also the mind, that the nafs also means the person, metonymy for the mind, okay? And so we created human beings and we know what even the mind thinks, what the mind tells itself. The reflective human being thinks about things. God said, we know all that, what the mind thinks. And we are closer to him even than his jugular vein. Well, and so this shows a great intimacy of the divine, and then it refers to the two angels, the angels who record our deeds. So we are in constant, being constantly being observed by those beings, angelic scribes that God has delegated to each human being, delegated to scribes that record our good deeds and our bad deeds. So we constantly monitored. We are constantly monitored, again driving home the Quran's moral message. Moral action is required from you. It's not the question how close you are to God or how far you are from God. You need to act correctly. But we are also not unkind to you that you think that, God is not close to you. Yes, he is close to you. Or, I just said he, but God doesn't have a gender either. In the Quran, the Arabic language uses the he gender, but it doesn't have to be specific. And so the divine is an enigma in many ways also. I mean, Christianity in some ways solves the problem of this enigmatic notion of the divine by talking about God the Father and the Son, right? And the Holy Spirit, and this kind of way in negotiating that. I think if we have further time, maybe there'll be an opportunity in the future when we can think about, how would this make sense to a Muslim to think about the triune God in ways that would find points of coincidence rather than ones of conflict. But I think it's important to understand, I think the ability that all religions have, or the difficulty that all religions have, how do they make the divine understandable? And how can we experience the divine? It's about this experience, right? So human beings always want to experience the divine, and therefore there's the intercession, right? So you know how controversial it is in some schools of theology in Islam, about that if you go to a saint and ask the saint to pray on your behalf and ask God because the saint has a stronger connection to God.
Yes.
If it's a living saint, it's okay. It's a saint that's already passed on, and you go to their shrine. Some people will say, of course, these individuals have a presence. You're invoking their presence to invoke God. Others will say, no.
It's almost like invoking something other than God.
Other than God, precisely. So it's the presence of pious people that some people will say that will be a sympathetic interpretation. Others will say that is going too close to something that Islam don't want to encourage, so rather close that door, because people might not understand presence from then worshipping that saint, right? So that's the boundary that Islam wants to preserve. Therefore, the emphasis on monotheism sometimes becomes very, very bland and very, very transcendent and almost an unreachable God or unknowable God, right? And sometimes Muslims like to err in favor of the unknowable God, because just worship and reverence rather than say, okay, I know who this God is, because it's too majestic, it's too great a being to comprehend, that everything we comprehend of the divine, we can only experience it with deficiency, or comprehend with deficiency. I shouldn't say experience. Mystics believe that we can come close to apprehending the divine through experience, that we get filled, right? And therefore you had mystics that say, you know, God is within me, I'm God, I'm God, right? And the famous statement of Hallaj or Bayezid Bistami and others, where they get overwhelmed by the presence of God. So while that is seen as kind of an exaggerated experience, or people could no longer control, it's not something that is encouraged, but rather that one must have this dialectical relationship, that God is closer to you than a jugular vein, and that God is also the unseen and in some ways unknowable, but we can experience.
This is perfect divine, because it brings us back to where we began almost, when we were speaking about resisting abstract notions of the divinity, or notions of the sensate and embodied quality of the Qur'an's God. So that's a wonderful way to conclude our conversation. But before we sort of officially end, I'd like to thank you very much. This was fabulous, and I think above all you show us the richness of the Islamic intellectual tradition and how many ways there are to understanding the Qur'an's rich language on God.
Thank you for inviting me.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you.